Now, just a few notes can be the difference between a great sounding lick and, well, an okay lick. And the notes that can make the difference are so-called chromatic notes, which is a series of tones that lie a half step apart. One chromatic notes technique in particular is very effective, and that is the enclosure. In music, an enclosure means that a target note is surrounded by other, often chromatic notes. Now, these enclosures result in a much more interesting and stronger melody in any style. In this lesson, I'll show you chromatic passing tones, different types and popular enclosures, examples of enclosures in different styles, and we look at some practice ideas. Chromatic notes are not that weird, because the chromatic scale is a scale too. In fact, the famous Flight of the Bumblebee, composed by Rimsky-Korsakov, uses almost exclusively the chromatic scale. We must understand that every scale in Western music is a descendant of that 12-tone chromatic scale, like the major scale, or the harmonic minor scale, or the melodic minor scale. The chromatic notes that are not in the scale will sound outside the expected sound. And we call them outside notes. If you're not used to that, you might not like the sound of these chromatic notes because they don't seem to fit in, for instance, a major scale. But when these outside notes are used in the right way, they will add a substantial value to the melody and lick in the form of color and tension notes. And the simplest way to use chromatic notes is using them as passing notes, which are chromatic outside notes that fill the gaps between the notes of a chord or the gaps between the notes of a scale. For instance, we can fill the whole tone and minor third gaps in a pentatonic scale. Now, an enclosure is a different concept. Here we have a target note that is surrounded by chromatic or diatonic notes. Now we embellish the target note, making it more interesting. An enclosure is most of the time applied to a chord tone that is on the beat, on a strong beat. Often followed by an arpeggio, but first we look at the isolated enclosure types. In any case, we have either an upper or a lower enclosure. The upper enclosure starts on a note above the target note, and the lower enclosure starts below the target note. Besides that, we can distinguish diatonic enclosures, where the target note is surrounded by notes from the scale or key. And there are also chromatic enclosures that use chromatic notes outside the key, close to the target note. And there are mixed enclosures, where we use diatonic and chromatic notes that surround the target note. And also, we can use the double chromatic enclosures that uses two chromatic notes on both sides of the target note. And there's the mixed and very popular variation where we use three enclosure notes, one on one side and two on the other side of the target note. So next up is the sound and application of these enclosures. The most straightforward enclosure is a target note that is surrounded by either two scale notes, two chromatic notes, or a mixed variant. And we call this a single enclosure. In the diagrams, the chromatic note is marked in orange, the target note in blue, and the diatonic enclosure note is marked in beige. In the key of C major, for instance, the C is surrounded by the diatonic scale notes B and G. Now, it can also be played as a so-called run-through, where we run through the target note to land on it again later. And we can apply this to all the notes of a C major chord arpeggio, like you see in this diagram. Now, when starting straight on the beat, the target note lies on a weak part of the beat. But starting after the beat, the target note lies on the strong part of the beat. The double enclosure is a richer embellishment, but it is also harder to play and to implement. In the double enclosure, the target note is surrounded by two chromatic notes on each side. The target note C, for instance, will be surrounded by the lower B flat and the note B on one side, and the higher D flat and D on the other side. In general, there are three ways to play the double chromatic enclosures. Now we could start on the highest note, and this makes it an upper enclosure. We can also start on the lowest note, which makes it a lower enclosure. And we can play it as a run-through where we play through the target note within the enclosure, so we hear the target note twice. Applied to an arpeggio, it sounds like this. And real examples will follow in a few minutes. Now, does a Joe Pass enclosure even exist? I don't know, but I hear his name often when the next enclosure comes up in a conversation. So, this enclosure is a mix of a single and double chromatic enclosure and is very popular and very effective. The target note, let's say C, is surrounded by a lower chromatic note B and two higher chromatic notes D flat and D. You can start either on the lower enclosure note B, like this, or you can start on the highest note like this. Applying this on a C major 7 arpeggio, it sounds like this. Now let's look at some examples with notes that are embellished with enclosures. And to be clear, the examples are simple, straightforward ideas. You have to listen to other musicians on different instruments to learn about the virtuosity and musicality that is spread by these giants. Now first we start with a simple example and something that Daniel Wise did in a similar example that illustrates the beauty of the basic and simple enclosures. By the way, you should check out his album Vortex, that is a great energetic fusion album. So in my example, the key is E major and the chords are E major 7, A major 7, A minor major 7, that is a nice substitution for the G altered dominant chord. Then C sharp minor 7 and the backdoor dominant D dominant 7. The melody without the enclosures sounds like this. Now the enclosures are marked, as you can see, in the tablature. All enclosures are diatonic, so notes from the E major scale. Let's listen how the enclosures have upgraded the melody. And here are some 2-5-1 examples. So let's take a look. The first example is in C major and it starts with a D minor 7 arpeggio where the minor third F is embellished with a Joe Pass style enclosure. Over the G dominant 7 chord, it starts with a single chromatic enclosure on the major third B of that G7 chord. After this there is an enclosure on the major third E of the tonic C major 7. In the next fusion style example, in D minor, I used different enclosures. So maybe it is a good idea for you to discover where and what kind of enclosures I used in this example. The example goes like this. By becoming a patron or channel member, you can get access to tabs, examples and backing tracks. Just that you know. In a blues progression, we can also add enclosures in a straightforward way that sounds a bit cliché. The enclosures are single chromatic enclosures that lead to the next chord tone, and there are a lot of them. This is just to show you that enclosures can be applied to any style. So here's the blues in A with enclosures. Why make music if you can practice, right? So there are many ways to the dark side of the Force, and I'll show you some of them. Now here are a few ideas to get started. The first one is a single enclosure on the first 5 chords of C major. The second exercise is a 3-note enclosure that starts after the beat. And in this way the target note is on the beat. The next exercise is a combination of 2 types of enclosures. The single chromatic enclosure and the double chromatic enclosure. The next exercise is a tough one. We have a Joe Pass type enclosure in the triad arpeggio of the first 4 chords in C major. The next exercise is about a double chromatic enclosure with a run-through applied to the notes of the C major triad. Now it's up to you to do something for a living and create variations of these exercises and be creative. In this lesson I showed you how you can upgrade your licks and melodies by using powerful enclosures. I showed you the different types of enclosures and how to use them in different situations. I hope the graphics and the tablature helped you to understand enclosures better. Now if you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. And if you know of great examples of enclosures, please let us know. And a special thanks to my long-term top 10 patrons. Thank you Timothy, James, Razor, Wim, Clive, Raven, Jim, Wolfram, James and Chris. I hope to see you all again next time. Bye.